From the Swiss Alps to the Canadian Rockies, celebrating unique connections between Switzerland and Canada. Brought to you by the Swiss representations in Canada. I hope you're all not too hungry right now because we are going to talk about all those delicious dishes from Switzerland right now. Our guest today is Andie, the chef behind the Swiss food blog Helvetic Kitchen. Welcome to our podcast, Andie.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for joining us today, Andie. And my name is Stefanie Wunderlin. I'm with the Consulate General of Switzerland in Vancouver. And if any of you follow our consulate on social media, you surely have come across Helvetic Kitchen. It is Andie's recipe blog all around Swiss cuisine. And I have to admit, Andie, that I was really surprised when I learned that the person behind these really traditional recipes is in fact not a Swiss, but a Canadian. So of course, you have to explain to us how you discovered Swiss food.
Of course, yeah. So I was born and raised in Canada, but my mother is Swiss and she moved to Canada as a young woman. And it was through her and through spending summers in Switzerland with my grandparents that I sort of was introduced to the wonderful world of Swiss cuisine.
And do you remember which dishes, from your childhood were the most the ones you liked most, be it from your grandmother or your mom?
Oh, absolutely. Of course, at home, even I grew up in Calgary and my mom would always make rhubarb tort, her Swiss carrot cake, which I loved. And I loved all the Christmas cookies so much. And they were really even a big hit in our Canadian neighborhood. She was always asked to bring Mailänderli and Brunzli and Zimtstern to parties in the neighborhood. Of course, when I was in Switzerland in the summers, there was my grandmother's cooking. She lived in the eastern part of the country. Her and my grandfather lived in Wallenstadt, but my grandmother herself was Bernese. So Zopf, of course, Zipfe figured into our Sunday morning breakfasts. Every Friday she made Weihe. I thought this was just the most delicious thing. It was always the summer, so she would always use wonderful summer fruits, Aprikose-Weihe or Zwetschge-Weihe. My favorite thing for dinner in the summertime was having my aunt's Bircher muesli with fresh berries from her garden. And really every evening, my grandparents or my aunt and uncle would serve café complet for dinner, which is basically, just bread and cheese. So it was just wonderful local bread, local cheese for dinner. And that just these memories of sitting outside and eating this really simple but delicious dinner that really, influenced me later from my love of food. And it's just wonderful memories of childhood in Switzerland.
Yeah, and those dishes you mentioned, they are really, really very traditional. And I think every person that has Swiss family or lived in Switzerland for a while knows all of these dishes. They are delicious.
Yeah.
And I know that later on, you actually became a trained pastry chef. And now that you tell me all of these dishes from Switzerland, most of them are baked, right? So the cookies, the cakes, the Zopf, the Weihe, it's all baked goods. So did your experience with Swiss baked goods influence your choice to become a pastry chef at all?
Yeah, I think so. I think sort of having these really delicious foods in childhood, I was always interested in baked goods. And when I became a pastry chef, we made a lot of different things from different countries, but I was always trying to make my Mailänderli as good as my mother's. And I sort of always tried to incorporate these Swiss baked goods that I remembered from childhood. I studied to be a pastry chef in Calgary at SAIT, and we had lots of instructors sort of from the German speaking realm. We had German instructors, Swiss instructors, and Austrian instructors, and they sort of also knew a lot about Swiss baked goods and Swiss patisserie and stuff. And we made a lot of them in class. A lot of them belong to the sort of classic cakes that you would make when you're learning to be a pastry chef. I know we made a Zuckerkirschtorte in school and things like that. I thought that was yeah, really wonderful to be able to combine these things, learning to be a pastry chef with these foods that I knew of from childhood.
It's really interesting that in a Canadian pastry school would teach how to do the Zuckerkirschtorte. That's really, really interesting, and I'm happy to hear that. Of course, I hope I can buy those cakes somewhere around here. I want to find them now.
Yeah, absolutely.
And your job as a pastry chef also brought you to Switzerland. If I'm correct, you came to work in Switzerland as a pastry chef at some point.
That's right. Yeah. So after I graduated in Canada, I worked in the industry there for a long time, and just sort of like many young people who were in the culinary industry, I sort of felt drawn to go to Europe and see how they did things there. Of course, I had this obvious connection to Switzerland, so it made sense for me to go there. I could live with my aunt and uncle for a while. They put me up, and I did many different stages in Swiss bakeries, and yeah, it was a really wonderful experience to be able to come to Switzerland and sort of see how it was done.
Mm-hmm. And today you don't just work in Switzerland, you actually live here now. You moved here with your husband and your daughter. You live in an actually very rural area in the Emmental in the canton of Bern. How do you like the life in Switzerland?
Yeah, I love it. So yeah, I met my husband, yeah, now 10 years ago in the city of Bern, which is where I sort of first lived when I moved here. And after sort of living and working there for a long time, we decided to make the change and move to the countryside. And now we live in a big old farmhouse here in the Emmental. It's wonderful, I have to say. The Bernese have a reputation of sort of being slow, laid
Mm-hmm.
back,
Mm-hmm.
easygoing.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we found here. It's wonderful. It's a really slow pace of life, and absolutely stunningly beautiful. Of course, I love going to the mountains, but I have to say that the landscape in the Emmental, sort of hiking around the beautiful hills, seeing all the beautiful Bauernhäuser and their
Mm-hmm.
beautiful gardens, it's just, yeah, it feels like living in a fairy tale. It's
Yeah.
wonderful.
I think it's also a region that many people, associate with typical Switzerland. You have a lot of cows around, I guess.
Mm.
So that's really the typical image of Switzerland.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we can see them from our kitchen window just across the street. There's farms with cows, and it's really lovely. I have to say also the friendliness and hospitality of the people who live in the Emmental has been also really wonderful. Not something that I expected, but they really have this reputation for Gastfreundlichkeit. You know,
Mm-hmm.
you really feel spoiled when you go to an Emmentaler Gasthof and you get a big plate of delicious food, and everybody's so
Mm-hmm.
friendly and welcoming. It's really wonderful.
And I imagine that food also really plays a big role in the community, right? It's also easier to make these connections when you're interested in food.
Yes, absolutely. And I have to, I mean, I feel absolutely spoiled and lucky. You know, we live in a little town called Trubschachen. It's famous because it's the home to the Cambly cookie factory, one of Switzerland's
Mm-hmm.
most famous cookie factories. And the cookie factory gets all of their raw ingredients from local farmers and local millers. So they buy their flour from our local mill, they buy butter and cream, milk from our local dairy, eggs from farmers nearby, and all of these things are also sold to the public. They have a little chazerei where you can go and buy this beautiful Emmentaler butter. You can go to the mill and buy big bags of flour. Yeah, you see these beautiful ingredients then
Mm-hmm.
put to use in this huge factory and make these wonderful cookies. It's
Mm-hmm.
amazing.
Mm-hmm. So when you moved to Switzerland, that's when you started your blog, Helvetic Kitchen. Is that correct?
It was actually a few years after I had moved there. I
Mm-hmm.
think this was once my husband and I were married, and yeah, we were sort of starting our family, and then yeah, that's when Helvetic Kitchen came about.
And where did this idea come from of this Swiss food blog in English? What was the idea behind it?
Yeah, mostly I really have to say that I just sort of got annoyed with my friends in Canada constantly asking me for my mother's cheese fondue recipe. And I thought, oh, I just got to put this online somewhere and then I can just send them a link. I don't have to type it out and explain it every time. It'll be great. I'll put some pictures too, and they'll be able to make it. And so then I thought of what other recipes I loved that my mother had made, like this rubly torte I mentioned, or her Christmas cookies. And I thought, oh, I'll just put all these online too. And then my husband started suggesting recipes that his mother made that were his favorites. And I sort of started putting them. And then it just snowballed from there. Like every recipe I found, then I found 10 more recipes I wanted to try, or another region I hadn't really looked at yet. And yeah, it's a wonderful experience to find all these different recipes, all this amazing food, and sort of be able to provide recipes that people can try it all over the world.
And I follow you on Instagram, and I see that you really have this passion for old cookbooks. So you go to thrift stores and such and find those really old traditional books with recipes. Where does this passion for this traditional way of cooking come from?
Yeah, I think it's sort of twofold. In one respect, it helps you learn the history of the sort of Swiss culinary landscape. Of course, you can sort of map through looking at these old cookbooks, things like when different food products started to be introduced into Switzerland. So I find that really interesting. And, when people in other parts of Switzerland became aware of different regional favorites from other regions and sort of this cross-regional exchange. But I think more fundamentally, I'm kind of just interested in why the food that your grandmother makes tastes better than other food.
Yeah.
And I think the secret lies sort of in these old cookbooks. The recipes are really simple. The ingredients are simple. And I think this way of cooking that you often see in these older cookbooks, you can sort of recreate sort of grandmother's food. And I'm really interested in that food that feels comforting and that feels nostalgic. And I'm especially interested when the food is kind of universally comforting. So for a dish like Alpler macaronen, of course, that's a really traditional Swiss dish. They made it on the Alp. It was something that was easy for the Alpine herdsmen to carry up with them. They could take pasta with them, which was lightweight. They would cook it in milk, which they had on the Alp. They would add potatoes, which they maybe had on the Alp, and then throw in the cheese that they were producing on the Alp. And that was an easy thing. But of course, I could say to my Canadian friend, like, this is just an example of macaroni and cheese. This is how the Swiss make their macaroni and cheese. And that is also something that is nostalgic for people in different parts of the world. And that is really interesting.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And it's also interesting to see that through those cookbooks, you also find a bit about the history and the stories of these dishes, right? So that's a really nice aspect that I haven't even thought about.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other, sometimes I'm really interested too in like domestic school textbooks. So Switzerland famously had a lot of schools for women where they would go and they would learn not only just recipes to cook, but also sort of like household management and things like that. And a lot of the women who ran these schools were sort of, revolutionary in their own right. Of course, Swiss women's rights doesn't have the best reputation, but you can sort of see an evolution of this through the women who ran these domestic schools, what they were teaching women to be able to accomplish in their own household. Yeah, you can also see an evolution of that through these old books, which is really fascinating.
Yeah, it's like doing research, huh? Going through these old books. That's really fascinating. And you talked about the initial reason why you started Helvetic Kitchen. It was, to share recipes with your friends in Canada. How is that today? Is it still the same, or who is the blog for now, and who is your audience?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So, of course, it is still for people abroad. of course, English speaking people.
Mm-hmm.
I have sort of three main audiences,
Mm-hmm.
Swiss abroad that are interested in the recipes in English, and their children. So lots of people have written to me saying like, oh, thank you so much for your recipe. It's just like my grocery maid, but I couldn't read her German recipe. You know, it's
Mm-hmm.
so nice to be able to read it in English. And then another audience, which I hadn't anticipated, but of course makes sense, is people who moved to Switzerland who are English speaking, who
Mm-hmm.
you know, are interested in the food here, but don't know all the traditions around it,
Yeah.
and maybe are married to a Swiss person and want to cook some of the favorite foods from the Swiss person, but maybe don't speak the national language here yet, and English is easier for them. So that is also good. Or actually, there's one more, and that's like people who have a Swiss sweetheart. And then I get a lot of like, oh, thank you so much for the Reese Casimir recipe. I made that for my Swiss sweetheart, and it reminded him of childhood or her of
Oh,
childhood. And that's really nice too. Yeah.
how romantic.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's really wonderful. And it must be also nice to get all these feedbacks, right, from people because it's such an emotional thing. Food is so emotional.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I have one one man wrote to me. He was a Canadian man in his 80s, and he was married to a Swiss woman,
Mhm.
and she was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. And he wrote that he wanted to make all of her favorite foods for her. She couldn't make them anymore, and he couldn't read her recipe books, so he found
Mm.
them on my blog and made them for his wife, and that I was so moving. And
Yeah.
yeah, that was so
That's a
kind.
really wonderful story. Wow, that's so nice to hear. You're making a difference in people's
Yeah.
lives.
Yeah. Yeah.
And of course, I would also like to know, you mentioned a few of your childhood favorites, but I mean, you cook Swiss food almost every day. At least it looks like that when I see your website. What are some of your personal favorite dishes today?
Yes, well, I have to be totally cliche and just say I
Mm.
really love cheese fondue. I
Mhm.
feel like I could eat it once a week. It's probably not the best idea, but if someone is really saying, Andy, what do you want to eat? What's your favorite Swiss? Yeah,
Mhm.
cheese fondue. I
Yeah,
just love it.
yeah.
And then some of the maybe lesser known things. There is this really wonderful dish from the Jura called, I'm not really sure how to pronounce it. I think it's called Tutsch, spelled Toetche. And this is like sort of a bready base and then kind of like a soured cream topping.
Mm.
Is
Mhm.
excellent with like a really crisp white wine. That's excellent. And
Mhm.
the food of Graubünden I feel like
Mm.
is really excellent. Capuns, which is
Mhm.
sort of like the spätzle wrapped in greens and then simmered in cream, or Maloons is sort of like buttery potato niblets, or Pizzockel, which is like a buckwheat dumpling. Yeah, all
Yeah,
very delicious, hearty alpine food.
yeah, yeah. Oh, I'm getting hungry
Yeah.
already. And of course, as you said, you grew up in Canada and Calgary. And so you had this comparison between Swiss food from your mom and then the local Canadian food. If you would have to compare the two traditions, what would you say are the main differences and also similarities between Canadian and Swiss cuisine?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the thing I noticed more when I moved to Switzerland, and that is that the Swiss really maintain a seasonality that you don't quite get in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
And that's like, you know, in the spring, strawberries are in season, and then every single restaurant has a dessert that has strawberries in it.
Yeah.
And then as
Yeah.
soon as strawberry season is over, you will not find another strawberry anywhere. And sort of the same goes for asparagus when it comes into season and all the summer fruits. And then in the fall, you have apple season. People are having freshly pressed apple juice, moshed, and cider. And then you have Wildseed,
Mhm.
and you have, you know, that's like your hunter's plate with game and spätzle and red cabbage and things like that.
Mhm.
And those things really stay in a specific time of year. You enjoy it then, and then it goes away. And I think that's a really wonderful trait of this Swiss yearly seasonal calendar, where you really look forward to something and then you devour it when it's available, and then you sort of forget about it for the rest of the year.
That is so true. I just had to think of vermicelle as well, that
Of
chestnut
course.
paste in fall and winter. So that's true. We really associate certain foods with certain times of the year. Absolutely. That is very true. And I also want to talk about, you already mentioned, those Swiss cookies that you love. And that's a great segue, because last fall you actually published a book on Swiss cookies, on traditional Swiss cookies. It's called Swiss Cookies, a Home-Baked Cultural Journey. So what can you tell us about the book and also the cultural journey you mentioned in the title?
Yeah, it was really a really wonderful experience to be able to write this book all about cookies. Of course, it felt really serendipitous, because I live in this town famous for a cookie factory. I can smell the cookies baking on most mornings. And the research for the book led me to the factory in town, and I learned a lot about the history of the famous cookie that they make here in the Emmental, the Bretzeli. Of course, that isn't only made in the Emmental, it's made in Fribourg and other regions as well, but the one from Cambly is very famous. And I was also able to visit many other cookie factories in Switzerland. I visited the oldest producer of Basler Leckerli in Basel, and learned the history of that cookie, and in Zurich, a factory that produces Tirkel. And of course, there's so much culture that goes along with these cookies, and they have so much meaning within these regions of Switzerland. And that was an amazing experience. It was really, really fascinating. And then of course I also included recipes from my own grandmother, some of her cookies, recipes from my mother-in-law and her mother-in-law. And it was really just a wonderful experience to find all these old recipes, find sort of the most interesting, most delicious Swiss cookies, and be able to combine them all into one book.
Actually, you already published other books before the Swiss Cookies book. One of them was called Drink Like a Swiss, all about Swiss drinks. Now, me personally, when I think about, what are typical Swiss drinks? Not many come to mind, actually. Maybe some Kirsch, Absinthe, maybe Coffee Lutz, a coffee with some schnapps. But that's it. So can you give us a bit of an insight of what Swiss people drink?
Absolutely, yeah. That was really interesting for me too. Swiss were historically really heavy drinkers, actually. Surely during the French Renaissance, there was a famous philosopher and essayist, Michel de Montaigne, and he even wrote about how the Swiss were the heaviest drinkers in all of Europe, basically.
Oh, wow.
And I guess that reputation has sort of faded, but surely if you've been to a fête de vendage, maybe in the French part of the country, you've been to a Fasnacht in Canton Lucerne or Basel, then you might have seen some heavy Swiss drinking even today. Of course, you mentioned one of the world's most infamous spirits, absinthe. That's from Switzerland. And really, the Swiss farmers make spirits with pretty much every possible fruit that you find on their farms. And they even make schnapps out of alpine herbs, out of hay, out of edelweiss, and anything that they can find. The Swiss are great brewers. They make a lot of beer here in Switzerland, a lot of craft beer. I think it still is true that the Swiss have the highest percentage of breweries per person in the world.
Oh, wow.
There's a lot of little tiny microbreweries.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Yeah.
Yeah. And of course, the Swiss are wonderful vintners, wine producers. Of course, if you live outside of Switzerland, you probably don't know that, because the Swiss tend to hoard all their wine and don't export any of it, enjoy it all here in the country, which is, it's so good. But yeah, and I guess also they are the dairy that they produce, milk, Switzerland's favorite soft drink, Rivella, of course, has milk serum in it. And the Swiss also have a huge influence on the world's coffee exports, with an espresso being Swiss and things like this. So they really have their fingers in all the pies and drink quite a lot.
Yeah. So when we talk about drinks in Switzerland, what are some of your favorite drinks? Maybe you also make some of your own syrup, for example. Are there some drinks that we can also find in your kitchen?
Absolutely, yeah. I really love this one that they make in one of the small towns here in the Emmental called Civil. They have a festival called the Brachete, and it happens in the fall, and it's where they used to spend the whole day threshing wheat to make linen. Is that right? Wheat, yeah. And the farmers' wives in the olden days would prepare this special schnapps called Bracherij Brons. I hope I'm saying that right. And this is like a caramel and caraway flavored schnapps. So you sort of just like caramelize sugar and add caraway, and then add like kirsch or another fruit schnapps to it. And it is so excellent. They used to say that they would drink that in the evening and the girls' cheeks would get rosy, and then the boys would choose one of the ladies to carry their spinning wheel home, and that meant that they were sort of together as a couple. So that's one of the sort of local drinks I really love. And I got to say, I love my mother-in-law's milk coffee. They drink that every morning, and when we stay at her house, I think she uses sort of that chicory coffee also in it, and it's really starts your morning well. Yeah.
It's really interesting to hear about all these typical drinks and foods, that as a Swiss, you don't really think about that much. And it's great that you compile all of this knowledge and all of this passion in your books. That's really wonderful. And maybe as a last question, if someone hears this now and they really have never cooked anything Swiss, what could be an easy and typical Swiss recipe that you could recommend them to try Swiss cuisine?
I think I would recommend the Alpler macaronen. I think I said before, it's something that is sort of nostalgic and familiar, but the Swiss twist on it is, of course, using potatoes. It makes an extra creamy sauce, and you're often serving it with, if you're in Switzerland, you serve it with cervelat, which is sort of like the national sausage. Of course, you can also serve it with bacon and applesauce, which is a wonderful addition to any kind of macaroni and cheese. And I think that would be the best. And I even have another variation on my blog that uses pumpkin instead of potatoes, which is also excellent.
That sounds great. So now you made us all very hungry and very eager to start cooking. Thank you so much, Andie, for being with us today and to tell us all about your Swiss cuisine, your Helvetic Kitchen. It was really a pleasure.
Oh, it was my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.